Okay, everyone, we still have a few people coming in, so we're going to give it just another minute or two before we start it off for the day. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Kim Ernst-Pitcher. I am the Director of Ecological Health with Prairie Rivers Network, and I'll be the moderator today for this presentation, Navigating Climate Challenges in the Quad Cities, a Comprehensive Assessment and Paths to Resilience. I want to thank you all for being here. And the goal of today's webinar is to share the climate assessment that's been made and create a space for you to ask questions and get answers to those questions. The goal of this work is to support the resilience of the Quad Cities through sharing the science-based information on risks and solutions, and the risks and solutions made available. For today, you can put your questions, please, in the Q&A, and the chat will be turned off. So at the end of the webinar, we will review the questions and open up the conversation for some discussion. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. For the next slide, please. Introduce our speakers. Nina Struess. It works to advance nature-based solutions specific to river health in the Quad Cities region. She educates, engages, and activates the public and community leaders about the benefits of natural river, wetland, and floodplain functions and their impacts on the Quad Cities. Nina joined PRN in 2023. Previously, she worked as a registered dietitian and intuitive eating counselor, focusing on improving the overall health and wellness of the Quad Cities community through nutrition and education, community presentations, public events, and media relations. She currently serves as a board member of Nest Cafe, the first pay-what-you-can restaurant in the Quad Cities. And she enjoys reading, gardening, and traveling, and spending time in nature with her husband and son. Arsam Patuk is the Senior Adaptation Specialist for the National Wildlife Federation. Her work focuses on advancing science-based climate adaptation and resilience to protect communities and ecosystems from the impacts of climate change and associated extreme events. In this role, she distills climate science and highlights innovative nature-based approaches to help communities and policy experts understand their baseline physical risks and develop equitable solutions in the face of climate-induced threats. She has authored and co-authored several publications on climate change impacts and adaptation, including the recently published Navigating Climate Challenges in the Quad Cities, a Comprehensive Assessment and Paths to Resilience. Before joining NWF, Arsam received her PhD in Environmental Science and Policy at the University of South Florida, where she researched and published on climate impacts and adaptation decision-making in small islands using a systems approach. Abhinav Vadva excuse me, is a postdoctoral research associate at Discovery Partners Institute of the University of Illinois System. His research interests span a wide array of areas, including urban stormwater management, design of green and gray infrastructure, uncertainty analysis and fuzzy systems, remote sensing and GIS, urban planning, and climate change adaptation. Excuse me. One of his notable research focuses is the integration of physical and machine learning-based hydrologic models with numerical weather prediction, or NWP, model forecasts to generate street-scale flooding forecasts. He has made significant contributions to the field with 11 journal articles, 2 book chapters, and presentations at numerous national and international conferences, concentrating on addressing the challenges faced by urban areas due to escalating flood risk. A standout achievement of his work includes the development of high-resolution flood inundation models for the Quad City region, showcasing the potential of various nature-based solutions and mitigating the rising flood risks. He holds a doctorate in water resource engineering and is actively involved in ongoing projects centered on developing flood forecasting systems and designing sustainable flood mitigation measures specifically tailored for Chicago and its surrounding neighborhoods. Next slide. Prairie Rivers Network is a statewide conservation organization in Illinois. Our mission is to protect water, heal land, and inspire change. Using the creative power of science, law, and collective action, Prairie Rivers protects and restores rivers, returns healthy soils and diverse wildlife to lands, and transforms how we care for the earth and for each other. We have a wide range of program areas, from the protection of water quality and biodiversity to ensuring that we meet our climate goals and transition to clean energy sources, all while holding industry accountable for the environmental hazards associated with a fossil fuel-based energy system. For this project, PRN collaborated with the Quad Cities stakeholders and gathered community input on localized climate risks for the assessment. Next slide, please. The National Wildlife Federation is a national conservation organization with decades of experience working on conservation and restoration issues along the Mississippi River and across the nation, which supports wildlife and communities. The Federation has successfully advocated for billions of dollars of federal funding to go towards ecosystem restoration projects and have been providing science, policy, and outreach expertise to communities and supporting the projects in overall community capacity. NWF has also led a climate vulnerability assessment in certain parts of Texas to provide the understanding of local risks and solutions, which turned out to be a successful model to secure funding for moving forward on the ground projects that are preferred by the community members. The idea of this assessment we are sharing today is to apply a similar model for the Quad Cities and push the needle on community resilience with a particular focus on sharing risks and conserving natural features to tackle those risks. And next slide. DPI's climate intelligent ecosystem translates the heart of the state-of-the-art climate science to provide focused solutions and services and update critical policies to guide climate resilient decisions. They bring their expertise of performing climate change assessments in the past for Chicago, Illinois, and the Great Lakes region. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Nina Struess with Prairie Rivers Network. Take it away, Nina.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you all for being here today. So a little bit about the project overview for you all today. In the summer of 2023, the National Wildlife Federation initiated a climate vulnerability assessment here in the Quad Cities to serve as a resource and tool to advance future conversations around natural infrastructure and resilience. The purpose of this assessment is to equip local leaders, decision makers, and community members within the Quad Cities with locally relevant information about the impacts of climate change, to empower community members to identify and pursue greater investments in the long-term resilience of their community, including through nature-based projects where appropriate, and finally, to serve as a foundation for stakeholders to make informed choices and leverage funding opportunities for the present and future of the region. So the product that is available today is a community-driven climate assessment for the Quad Cities region with input from relevant stakeholders. Next slide, please. So why the Quad Cities? We've had this question come up many times, and if you're unfamiliar with the Quad Cities, we are comprised of 5 cities that are situated along where the Mississippi River runs east to west. We have Bettendorf and Davenport on the Iowa side, and Rock Island, Moline, and East Moline on the Illinois side. And the Quad Cities has immense potential for continued investment in natural infrastructure. With proximity to not only the Mississippi River, but also the Rock Rivers, there is a heightened flood risk as well for the environments and the surrounding areas. But there's also a unique combination of ecological, economic, and social factors too that make this bi-state region the perfect place for this assessment. Next slide, please. The assessment combined scientific modeling with community outreach and input to ground truth the science. DPI created the first ever localized flood inundation model for Quad Cities, incorporating future climate change as well as land use and population projections. Simultaneously, we engaged key stakeholders in the region through interviews and public input sessions to understand their perspectives on the risks they're facing, the areas and communities that are most vulnerable, and the current extent of planning going on in the region to help mitigate those risks. The combination of scientific modeling and public engagement in the creation of this assessment was central to us to make sure the final findings are usable and accessible to people working within this space. Next slide, please. So after conducting several interviews with regional natural resource professionals, conservation staff, city municipalities, various nonprofit and other organizations and community leaders, we were able to identify some specific community identified climate risks. And it's no surprise that flooding, whether it was river flooding or flash flooding, were some of the primary risks associated with the Quad Cities. In addition, we had extreme weather, a wildfire, drought, extreme heat, and other weather-related events that did come up within conversations as well. And I am going to now turn it over to Abhinav for our next part.
Thank you, Nina. Next slide, please. So as Nina mentioned that DPI has developed a local street state flood forecast system for Quad Cities. So in development, what we have done is we have taken a two-way approach where we have taken the on-ground data of land use, the topographical data, geomorphological data, population data, building height data, tree canopies, and the wetlands or other natural systems. We integrated these all data sets to a hydrological model, which was developed using a stormwater management model, which is developed by EPA. We integrated that stormwater management model, which is called SWMM, SWIM, generally known, to a HECRAS flood inundation model, where we have integrated the time series SWMM output to HECRAS to generate these flood forecasts or the flood inundation maps. An example of it is shown here. So what we have done in the assessment is we have divided the assessment in three parts, where we have given early century flood inundation map, mid-century flood inundation map, and end of the century flood inundation maps. So when we see the early century flood inundation maps over here on the screen, so we can see the dark blue region, which is the Mississippi River, and if you see here, you have yellow and other colors, which shows the flood inundation depth at that particular instance, which provides you how much is the water getting stagnated in that region, and what is the region which is vulnerable to the flooding. And when we talk about the other maps, just for example, if you go to the next slide, the mid-century, you can see Rock Island or Devonport or Bettendorf, East Moline and Moline. The coastal regions are mostly on flood risk, and many of those regions have somewhat around 1 to 1.5 feet of water, which gets inundated or which gets stagnated in many of the extreme events. Next slide, please. When we come to end of the century, I think there was some issue with the format. So yeah, when we come to end of the century, and if we see here, the flood inundation in all the 5 cities is huge and it changes with time. It's just one particular moment which we are showing on the map, but when we see the time series of these flood inundation maps, it changes with time and few areas gets inundated quite often, which has been taken into account in the assessment to generate different solutions to mitigate those flood inundation risk. Next slide, please. So when we see all these time series analysis of the flood inundation map, we came up with a matrix where we saw at every decade how the flood inundation maps or flood inundation is changing with time in all the cities. And here we found out that there are cities at every decade, there are cities where the flood inundation is changing with time, and it doesn't matter like if on when we go on to future, the flood inundation will increase or will decrease. It is based on the climate uh, at that particular moment and what precipitation we are observing at that particular moment. So when we talk about here, the alarming events or what we are showing here as alarming events are the events where our extreme rainfall is more than 3 inches per hour. Those are categorized as alarming events, and those are the events where the area can be on a huge risk of flooding. Thank you. Yeah, next slide, please. Now I'll hand it over to Arsum.
Thanks, Abhinav. So in addition to flooding, which as we've seen is a major concern, extreme heat was also flagged during the stakeholder conversations that we had in our interviews. So in the Quad cities, based on the Federal Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation tool, which is created by the US Global Research Program, we can expect to see more hot days, so days when temperature increases above 95 degrees, which is the graph on your left, and then extremely hot days, so when temperature increases above 100 degrees, the graph on your right side of the screen. The number of hot days, they can increase anywhere from 3 days at present to between 28 to 58 days based on the rate of global greenhouse gas emissions. And then the number of extremely hot days, they will also go up, where under an extreme scenario of greenhouse gas emissions, we can see almost a month, about 30 days of extreme heat in the region. For our wildlife and biodiversity who need certain temperature ranges to function and survive, it poses, of course, a huge threat to the existence and the functioning of these ecosystems and biodiversity, but also it adds stress to human health, causing difficulties to breathe and increasing risks of heat strokes if ourselves and the systems are not prepared to deal with these future changes. Next slide, please. And then extreme events in general was a potential concern raised by a lot of stakeholders. The one that's most closely tied to climate change is the wildlife risks to the region due to those increasing temperatures leading to prolonged drought conditions. Based on the US Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Risk to Communities tool, we found Rock Island and Davenport facing medium risks of wildfire, which is higher than about 40% of the communities across the country. And then for both Bettendorf as well as Moline and East Moline area, the risks were significantly low, which could be due to how the existing land cover, housing units, and population extent is spread out across the Quad Cities region. Next slide. So in our assessment, our intention was really to connect the dots between this information on climate risks and how it impacts the communities and natural features on the ground. Wetlands like Nahan Marsh and the Quad Cities Conservation Alliance Wetland Center, they face challenges with disruptions in the water balance due to more frequent droughts and flash floods that are projected for the future. impacting the aquatic and wildlife that calls these habitats home. Then also changing temperature and precipitation patterns can alter forests, like the Loud Thunder Forest Preserve located in Rock Island County, making it unsuitable for the tree species that are already there, and also potentially opening doors for non-native species to replace those existing tree species. And losing these critical ecosystems also means that we will potentially be losing all the benefits that are provided by these systems to the communities and wildlife. One really interesting statistics is that trees in the Quad Cities, they soaked an estimated 69 million gallons of stormwater runoff, absorbed nearly 3 million pounds of air pollution, and removed more than 100,000 tons of carbon pollution from the air annually. So providing both the climate adaptation as well as mitigation benefits. And this also means that the impacts that we are estimating might be even more severe if we lose the buffer that is already provided by nature and natural features. Next slide, please. In addition to natural features, critical facilities will be at risk. The maps here show the I-74 and Centennial Bridge and the extent of flooding by the end of century. If you click on the slide, we also found the portions of a lot of other tourism spots like the Rock Island Arsenal Club, Martin Luther King Center, the Vibrant Arena at the Mark, the Yacht Club, and a lot of those major tourism attractions and gathering grounds that generate economic revenues and also provide opportunities for social cohesion among community members being prone to flooding in the early as well as end of century projections. Then if we click next, water quality and quantity. So both too much water due to heavy rainfall and too little water due to droughts and upstream water use can negatively impact the communities, plants, as well as animals that depend on the river. Next slide, please. Of course, the risks are not similar. They will vary based on who is facing them. When an extreme event strikes, certain factors such as race, ethnicity, income status, influences, well, rather lowers an individual's capacity to deal with it during the event, and also the amount of resources and expertise communities receive after the event. So this adds to this layer of social vulnerability, in addition to the physical vulnerability that the communities are already facing. So this is a map of social vulnerability for the Quad Cities. We found downtown Quad Cities, locations along the Mississippi main stem, and then also areas in East Moline standing out to be the most vulnerable. Often these vulnerable groups, they are separated in clusters and pockets. So they anyway have limited access to information and resources to prepare for a lot of these potential climate-induced hazards that we chatted about earlier. If we click on the slide, there's a graph with, and there's a lot going on here, but I will flag the idea of this graph is to compare the number of socially vulnerable people in Davenport, East Moline, and Rock Island to the rest of the country. So what we found was that there were more people of color in Rock Island and East Moline, and then a higher percentage of people without a high school degree, living in poverty, renting property, and then with disabilities in the three cities. All of the factors influencing your ability to deal with an event, an extreme event, and how you prepare for it and prepare and mitigate for the event post the disaster. Next slide. I will emphasize that the findings seem a lot and a little scary, but this is by no way meant to be a doom and gloom report. The risks are not static. They are still based on the climate projections and emission scenarios, the paths that we are taking today, but also the risks can change based on the paths we take today. So the actions and policies that we enact today can change the future greenhouse gas emissions and the flooding scenarios. In any case, it is clear that we do need to adapt to these future impacts. And then we need solutions that are science-based, that are dynamic, that can keep up with these future changes. And that's why leveraging our natural features and the buffer and protective benefits that they provide can be one of our best bets to prepare for these events. Next slide. What are nature-based solutions? So the idea of these nature-based solutions, or you might hear the terms such as natural infrastructure or green infrastructure, but the basic idea centers around conservation and restoration of natural features. It can also be combined with gray infrastructure to make those systems more resilient. And these natural systems can offer both climate adaptation as well as mitigation benefits, and also provide a range of other community-wide benefits, such as water quality improvements, habitat for the wildlife, soaking carbon dioxide, and also the opportunities to recreate amongst the community members. These can be as simple as planting trees or protecting the riparian buffers. Could also be large-scale interventions such as restoring floodplains and bottomland forests, so the images that you see on your left. And then also the approaches like conservation practices and easements to protect and restore the critical ecosystems are under that blanket of nature-based solutions. We have a lot of good research that these solutions are equally effective when compared to traditional flood mitigation solutions. And we did a similar analysis for our report to showcase the effectiveness of these solutions. I will pass it on to Abhinav to chat about that analysis.
Thank you, Arsum. Next slide, please. So as Arsum was mentioning about the nature-based solutions, what nature-based solutions actually do when we talk in terms of flooding. So nature-based solution provides a platform where the water can get infiltrated to the confined and unconfined system, or water can get stored for some time so that the area doesn't get inundated or the water doesn't get stagnated there. And after the flood event, the water passes or water get transported to the next downstream section. So what we have done in this analysis is we have taken some nature-based solutions as mentioned by Arsum in the previous slide. And in technical terms or in the modeling terms, those are referred to as the low impact development controls. Typically, they are green infrastructure, bioretention ponds, infiltration trenches, vegetative swales, rain barrels, and so on. So we have taken up an approach where we took these nature-based solutions as silos, and then we applied that in different regions of Quad Cities. We found out how much is the flood inundation getting reduced with these nature-based solutions, and we tried again a combination of these. So what we can say in terms of the location of these nature-based solution is the nature-based solutions are of three different types. One type is the storage-based nature-based solution. Another type is the infiltration or the nature-based solutions which allows infiltration. And the third one is both in combination of nature-based solution, both in combination of infiltration type and storage type. So we have tried all these three types of nature-based solutions in the detailed report, you can see the combinations which we have tried and which we have shown pictorially. And here now, if you see, when we talk about early century of the flooding scenarios, before the implementation of nature-based solution, which is the graph to the on the top, and after the implementation of those nature-based solutions. So you can see the drastic change in the flooding depth or flood inundation in Devonport and Bettendorf, whereas in East Moline and the East Moline region, the flooding has drastically reduced. Similar analysis when we see in mid-century. Next slide, please. So there, if we see again, above graph above map is for without nature-based solution, and below graph is for the with nature-based solutions. So you see the you're seeing the drastic change in the flood extents or flood inundation, which has happened in the mid-century. And now when you see, when we talk about these nature-based solutions, how they reduce the flooding, where the water goes, is all the questions which comes up. The water is still there in the system. It comes out when the flood event has been surpassed. Next slide, please. When we talk about the end of the century, again, you can see there's a lot of regions which were flooded in the end of the century, as you can see in the above graph. But after the implementation of the nature-based solutions, those areas, the flooding has reduced drastically, and the areas are quite safer in terms of flood risk. Next slide, please. So combining the whole analysis from 2020 to 2100, that is the end of the century, we have first, as I was showing you earlier, the number of alarming events. To your left, what you can see are without the nature-based solutions, how the alarming events were there, how much alarming events were there in all the cities. And now, after the implementation of nature-based solutions, you can see the number of alarming events which has been reduced quite significantly. When we talk about the early century, and then number of alarming events has been drastically reduced in Rock Island and in East Moline. And when we come to the mid-century, again, East Moline, Bettendorf, Rock Island, and Devonport, all four, in all the four cities, the number of alarming events has been reduced drastically. And when we come on to the end of the century, you can even see the number of alarming events in Bettendorf and East Moline is not even there due to the implementation of these nature-based solutions. So you can now realize what are the benefits of these nature-based solutions when we talk about flood risk and when we want to reduce the amount of damages which are happening due to flood. Next slide, please. So now I hand it over to Arsum again.
Handing it over to me.
Oh, sorry, Nina.
It's okay. Thank you, Abhinav. So one key component of this assessment is to really make sure, because when you look at some of these findings, it can be overwhelming and feel kind of doom and gloom, but there is a lot of potential for a lot of opportunity to be able to see some benefits through nature-based solutions. And the NWF has developed a set of considerations to help communities like the Quad Cities start thinking about nature-based solutions in planning and implementation. This includes recognizing natural systems and processes as critical infrastructure, given the protective benefits and the community co-benefits that they provide, considering the climate impacts on key natural assets, not just social systems and infrastructures, and then protecting and restoring the critical natural features at immediate risk. Equity implications are, of course, central to any planning process, but also in the design and application of nature-based solutions. These are not silver bullet solutions, and they can end up missing out or at times harming the communities that they intend to benefit. So very important that we are intentional about the way these solutions are planned and implemented, and that they are able to mitigate the past inequities and negative consequences and do so in a manner that reflects community engagement and needs. Next, ensuring that nature-based solutions yield net positive biodiversity benefits, giving natural features and processes space to function. And finally, nature-based solutions, where possible, should be integrated into existing planning processes rather than creating new processes to ensure their adoption, implementation, and funding, because we want to see more and more of these types of projects in action. Next slide, please. During our conversations with the community, through our input sessions and other conversations as well, we were able to identify different areas to look towards where there might be some potential opportunities as well as potential barriers or gaps for advancing nature-based solutions specific here to the Quad Cities. And we found 3 different silos here to come up very repeatedly in these conversations. Education was a very primary silo that did come up, and education in various formats, whether it was surrounding community resilience and program cohesion. So taking a look at different programs and opportunities that are currently available and coming together for a more cohesive plan. Supporting climate training and place-based learning in schools, well, also along with technical experts and other potential audiences. Enhancing further collaboration and coordination through education, and then focusing on education to foster advocacy for policy initiatives that might support both local and statewide planning initiatives. Research was also another that came up. So collecting baseline information for future projects that build upon this assessment, and then including community leaders from areas most adversely affected in these climate conversations from the start. And then hopefully, identifying those on the ground projects and their benefits for reducing the climate hazard risks that can help support the community resilience. And then of course, funding. So none of this can be possible without funding. And that was a struggle that was brought up as well. So continuing to support research and education efforts in the community based off of community needs and priorities, and supporting planning for project identification that results in that community-led and community-preferred nature-based solution. And then hopefully leading to that implementation of projects. Next slide, please. As we talk about funding that did come up, in our conversation several times, the NWF does have a nature-based solutions funding database where you can go and search based off of your specific criteria. And it is available via this QR code that you see here, and can be a really great place for organizations or individuals to be able to start when looking at potential projects. I also want to make sure that we're calling out the historical funding opportunities that we have available right now through the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and then also to looking at our community as well. The Quad Cities is a vibrant community that does support and is furthering their support, especially in environmental initiatives, looking at grant funding that specializes in education on climate change, and even newer grant funding that's looking at improving the equity around the Mississippi River as well. Next slide, please. So what are our next steps and future for this assessment? I don't think we've said this once yet, but it is important to make sure that we are saying that this report is a wealth of information, but it is not a prescriptive plan. We are not, providing specific solutions for specific areas or communities or, cities. Really, this is something where our communities can come together and unify to find those next steps that are going to be specific to those areas. We did ask our community, though, through these sessions, what they thought could be potential next steps once this assessment is after the release of this assessment. And you can see some of those here, many surrounding using the data here to help apply for grant funding in order to support that infrastructure resilience, nature-based solution initiatives within their communities, communicating with policy and decision makers within the communities within the state, about the urgency of including nature-based solutions in the planning processes and implementation processes to help combat these climate risks, advocacy for a more equitable vision for resilience surrounding these climate risks, and then making sure that our workforce is ready for the increase in potential nature-based products. Do we have a robust workforce that can design and implement and maintain these structures and these solutions? Education continued to be a common thread focused on the necessity for why nature-based solutions are important, what the benefits are within various communities, as well as within the businesses and media outlets. And then finally, too, making sure that we are looking at the bigger picture, zooming out within the watershed and looking upstream to rural and agricultural impacts and how those affect the Quad Cities as well. Next slide, please. We want to take the time to thank you all for being here today. The QR code up here in the corner is a direct link to the full assessment that you can access. We're so excited to have this out into the world finally. And thank you for being here, and we'll open it up now for our questions.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, everyone. So yes, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And I will go ahead and kick us off by asking one question. This can kind of go to all three of the presenters today. How do we translate the findings to next steps?
I can take a stab and then let Nina and Abhinav add to it. So for our assessment, as we mentioned, the goal is to start these conversations on this baseline understanding of climate risks and what solutions are available. We have been very intentional about not being prescriptive in providing specific set of solutions, but we do want to continue refining the recommendations that we have developed through public input sessions and stakeholder engagement. So as next steps, our goal is to continue disseminating this product out to audiences who would find this information useful and usable in the work that they're doing. Use it to create that broader understanding of climate risks and how those risks connects to communities and natural features on the ground. And then identify community champions to start forward some of that planning process for good projects to move forward. And when I say move forward the projects, we don't see NWF or PRN necessarily going in the field and working the projects, but really supporting the capacity of organizations who have the vision to move some of this work forward.
Maybe adding on to what Arzu was mentioning, the nature-based solutions are we have taken the nature-based solution in terms of the mitigating the flood risk, but nature-based solutions also have many other advantages. And when we talk in layman terms, these nature-based solutions gives the area an aesthetics. It gives good attraction for the tourism. It gives many psychological benefits to different communities. It gives you good water quality, then reduction, or it can reduce the extreme heat. It can provide you playgrounds, you can go around, you can camp, and so on. So there are many other advantages apart from the flood risk for these nature-based solutions. So in terms of translating the findings from these these assessment, we can look forward to do those assessments and make those assessment in a quantitative manner so that attracts to the champions and that encourages the communities and other leaders to apply these nature-based solutions in the communities to mitigate different kinds of risks.
Thank you. Excellent. We have a question here in the Q&A. Were the flooding levels on the river expressed as flood stage according to the Rock Island Lock and Dam flood stage level or as sea level estimates?
Yeah, let me answer to that. So these flood levels or which we have shown in our maps are the flood stages in Rock Island and the dam flood stage levels. So these are the stage levels. Yes.
Okay, when the next question is, could you elaborate on how bridges could be affected by future flooding, especially the I-74 bridge? It is so high above the water. Would the river rise above to the bridge, above the bridge?
So yeah, when we talk about the flooding, which was shown in the bridges, it's not only the water which is coming above the bridges. The nearby regions which are there near to the bridges are on a lower elevation, and those areas tend to flood more because the flood walls are on a lesser height as compared to the bridge. But there are some instances or there are some events in mid century and the end century where the water can rise above the bridge height also, and it can surpass the bridge level as well when
And
we
I
talk
will,
about the extreme climate assessment. Yeah, Arzu, please.
I will also add that this is not just the river flood risk that we're talking about. It's also the flash flooding caused by those alarming events that Abhinav mentioned earlier in the slide deck. So a lot of standing water on the bridges where the potential for the water to infiltrate is lower than the amount of rainfall falling, which would lead to flooding on these critical infrastructure systems.
Great. Any other comments on that one? All right. Can you elaborate a little bit on the community engagement for this project? Who all was involved? How was it performed, etc.?
Sure, I can start with that one. And so the community engagement piece started with interviews with stakeholders in the community. We did about 30 interviews with natural resource professionals, conservation professionals, nonprofits, community leaders, a really varied group of individuals. And from there, we were able to identify those specific community climate risks. And then the next stage of community engagement really came in the form of those community input sessions. And so once we had some of the findings that were available for review, we wanted to make sure that we were ground truthing what we were finding, as well as on being able to identify other barriers, gaps, or needs for to be included into the assessment. And so we had 3 input sessions that were where we had the previous stakeholders invited, but we did also open it up for other stakeholders within the community to be able to come as an open invitation to provide input on those initial climate assessment findings. And from there, we were able to get a lot of feedback that you will see in the actual report that you've seen some of today, in terms of just, what are the areas of most interest, what are some of the ideas that are already being floated around, and where are the barriers and the struggles as well. And I want to make sure that we emphasize that this will continue to be a community-driven product. It will continue to be a living document where the community is the one that will hopefully, take ownership of and help drive these these future opportunities and potential projects to help create and foster that resilience here in the region. So I know I didn't speak on it in one of the questions before with those next steps, where are we going? But I just foresee myself having lots of conversations with individuals in the community, groups, anybody that is interested in providing feedback or looking for more opportunities to improve the resilience here in the region.
Great, thank you. There is a couple more questions here that I'd like to try to hit on. Record historic crest of the Mississippi River at the Rock Island Gauge was 22.7 feet set in 2019. Do you expect us to rise above that frequently as a result of climate change? You know, that's a tough one, but does anyone want to try to answer that one?
Yeah, I think I was just replying to the Q&A there only, but yeah, I can explain it in more detail here. So the flood assessment, the flood risk assessment, what we have done over here in this report is based on the high emission climate scenario, which is kind of considered as a worst case scenario. And we have replicated the 2000, when we were developing the model, we have replicated this 2019 flood event, where in Rock Island there was 22.7 feet, 22.7 plus feet of water which was stagnated. And with our climate assessments, when we see the trend in the precipitation and when we induce that into our model, we have a chance that we can get these kind of similar events. So to maybe to say that in more sophisticated manner, what we have done is we have also analyzed what can be the occurrence of these kind of events, or what can be the change in occurrence of these kind of events due to climate change in our assessment. And we found that the 1 in 100-year flood event, which has occurred in 2019, can occur maybe, or might occur according to the extreme or high emission climate model in 1 in 50 or 1 in 55 or so. So yes, there is a possibility that a similar event can happen if we do not apply any nature-based solution or any other flood mitigation measure.
Great, thank you. And the next question, I think, is for Arsam, and is there a map showing heat islands that we can pinpoint where trees are needed to reduce temperatures in that area?
Yes, so on page 52 of our assessment, we have a map on the tree equity scores, which essentially measures the benefit of the trees for communities, for low-income communities of colors and other communities that are disproportionately impacted by extreme heat and other environmental hazards. So that's a really good map to start prioritizing where there's greater priority for tree planting. And then I was going to take the next question if no one has anything to add to this one.
Can I say something on the tree equity? So I just wanted to mention, as we talk about funding, there is some funding available as well. If you are on the Illinois side and do find that you are within that lower tree equity score, I have information to be able to provide on funding for tree plantings to be able to support that as well. So if there is anybody within the community that's interested, they can reach out to me and I'd be happy to make that connection further.
Nina, could you put your email in the chat if you're...
Absolutely.
Arsam, you want me to read the next question? Or just...
Sure, if you want to provide context then.
Sure. The question was, some in our community may see the displacement of people who live in the floodplains as necessary for enacting nature-based solutions. How can we protect these existing communities against this?
So this is a great question, and honestly, I don't think any of us have the right answer for it, but I'm really glad to see it because it shows that we are open to having these conversations as a way of this assessment. One thing I will say is that flood buyouts and displacing the properties and communities in the floodplain is really tricky. They have a past riddled with inequities and have done a lot of harms with displacing the communities. So I think any displacement and a buyout program needs to be really well intentioned and well thought out. Need to put the resilience of communities and the resources they're getting and the places where we are relocating them to has to be at the center of those conversations. And even more so, bringing in the communities that are getting displaced needs to be actively engaged as we devise these projects to displace and move the communities. So again, we don't have the right set of expertise to answer that at the moment. But one thing I would really echo is that the communities that it will be most impacted should be at the table when those decisions are made. Nina, if you have anything to add to that.
I think you summed it up perfectly. And excuse me, I know Prairie Rivers Network here. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but I am based here in the Quad Cities. While we are statewide, I am based here in the Quad Cities and would love to be able to help in that process of bringing the people who are going to be most affected and necessary in these conversations to the table, or helping to provide the support in any way possible.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of our presenters and the organizations that they're representing today, and for all the attendees and asking such great questions. Thank you for being here with us.